Welcome back to some new petty revenge stories, where people share small victories over those who wronged them. I hope you had a great day. Thanks for all the likes and comments on the last video. And now let's start with the first story. It's called Obnoxious Passenger. I'm a South African living in Japan, and a while back my Japanese wife and I traveled to South Africa to visit my parents and have our honeymoon. On our journey back we had 3 flights, and the first leg was from Johannesburg to Qatar. That's where the story begins. We were seated and getting settled when I noticed a group of passengers wearing matching t-shirts from a pharmaceutical company. Among them was a woman I'll call Brandy, sitting behind us with 2 co-workers. She was loud, chatty and a bit over the top, but I was more focused on my nerves about the flight than her antics. Once we were airborne, Brandy started ordering brandy and coke for herself and her co-workers. With each drink, her voice got louder, and by her 6th drink, her conversation turned to some rather controversial topics, including disapproval of interracial relationships. Even with my earbuds in and music playing, I could hear her loud and clear. Things escalated when a passenger, a few seats away, politely asked Brandy to quiet down, saying she was trying to sleep. Brandy snapped back, insisting that it wasn't a nighttime flight and the woman should use earplugs. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted, and you could feel everyone silently bracing for what would come next. Later, a flight attendant asked Brandy to tone it down. She agreed briefly, but soon got back to her loud chatter. A mother with a young child even approached her, pleading for quiet because her child kept waking up. Brandy responded dismissively and didn't take the request seriously. At this point, the flight attendants had enough and closed the bar for our cabin. This annoyed me because I had planned to enjoy a whiskey or 2 before we landed. But Brandy wasn't done. She opened her duty-free bottle of brandy and continued to drink and talk, even louder than before. Meanwhile, my wife, who I thought was peacefully resting, pulled out her earbud, looked through the seat crack at Brandy, and then gave me a look of pure frustration. That's when I decided enough was enough. I stood up and loudly addressed the cabin. "Excuse me everyone," by a show of hands. Who would like these people to quiet down? Around 30 passengers raised their hands. I turned to Brandy, pointed and said, "Look, understand? Quiet down." The cabin erupted in applause, and even the flight attendant seemed relieved. Brandy and her group finally quieted down, and I could relax with my wife. One of the attendants even brought me a Coke with a couple of small bottles of whiskey as a thank you. But Brandy wasn't done. On the descent she started playing games on the screen attached to the back of my seat, pressing the buttons hard enough to make my seat move. I ignored her. When the plane landed and we started disembarking, Brandy began insulting me, making comments about my rate and my interracial marriage. I didn't respond, just smiled and left the plane. My wife and I found a cafe to relax before our next flight. Then at the gate for our 2nd flight to Malaysia, I saw Brandy again. She was taking selfies and didn't notice me. I struck up a conversation with a co-worker of hers to confirm her name. Then, while waiting, I connected to the airport Wi-Fi and sent a detailed account of her behavior to her company through their website and social media. The next 2 flights were thankfully uneventful, and we made it home to Japan safely. 2 weeks later, I received a reply from the CEO of the company, asking to speak with me. He called, profusely apologized, and told me that Brandy had been put on the next flight back to South Africa upon arrival in Malaysia. She was fired the moment she landed in Johannesburg. To celebrate, I picked up a bottle of brandy and some coke on the way home from work. My wife and I toasted to a peaceful future of traveling together. The next story is called Mouthy Tradesman. I used to own a small construction company specializing in interior improvements. About 20 years ago, we were working on a fairly large project, and I had brought in all my usual subcontractors: drywall, electrical, HVAC, you name it. One day while visiting the site, I was dressed in my typical shabby work clothes and decided to help tidy up a bit, since the job was getting cluttered. An electrician, one of the subcontractor's employees, was also cleaning up nearby. He didn't know who I was, which made what happened next even more interesting. I was standing near a dumpster that belonged to another tenant in the building. We weren't allowed to use that dumpster, for obvious reasons. The electrician walked up, dumped some trash in it, and walked away. I politely informed him, "That's not our bin. We are not supposed to use it." His response? "Ain't life a pain?" And off he went. A couple of minutes later, he came back with more trash and dumped it into the same bin. This time I told him firmly, "This isn't ours to use. Take it out." He looked at me with a blank stare and asked, "Who are you?" I smiled and calmly replied, "I'm the general contractor. That's who." His expression immediately changed, and he quickly started apologizing while removing the trash from the bin. From that point on, he seemed to avoid me like the plague. He'd always be wherever I wasn't on the site. A couple of weeks later, he came over and gave me a sheepish apology. I told him, "You never know who you are talking to, so don't take an attitude with anyone." Honestly, the guy wasn't great at his job. A bit of a social project by his boss, if you know what I mean. Not long after, I decided to switch electricians altogether. The third story is called Male Bravado. I recently went for a food tasting at an Indian restaurant for an event I'm planning with 3 of my older male colleagues and friends. From the moment we walked in, the restaurant owner assumed one of my male friends was the person in charge and the one with the money. I'm naturally a quieter person when you first meet me, so I understand why he might have made that assumption, but it was still frustrating. During the food tasting, the owner gave a decent sales pitch and tried to inject humor into the conversation. At one point, as we discussed catering, he turned to one of my male friends and asked if I could cook, because I didn't look like it from how skinny I am, completely ignoring me, as if I weren't an equal participant in the conversation. I simply stared at him with a blank, unreadable expression. I didn't see the point in dignifying such a ridiculous comment with a response, but my reaction was enough to make him visibly uncomfortable. He quickly backtracked, saying, "Sorry, I'm just being an awkward uncle." Despite the awkward comment, I didn't immediately rule out the venue. We continued discussing logistics like corkage fees and drinks. However, the owner then made another comment, gesturing towards me as the youngest in the group, saying, "You'll need to limit the shots, because you know how the younger ones can get," implying I might go crazy. One of my friends jumped in to clarify that I don't drink, because I'm Buddhist. But the owner doubled down, joking about how girls go wild. At this point, I was starting to feel as though he saw me as anything but a professional. It was condescending, to say the least. Once again, I didn't respond. I just stared at him. The awkward silence that followed said more than I ever could. Toward the end of the tasting, he seemed convinced we would book the venue. Without confirming anything with us, he brought over our cost spreadsheet and card machine. As a joke, which completely fell flat, he handed me the card machine and said, £500 deposit, before laughing and adding, "Don't worry, just kidding. Look at her face." The table fell silent, and the men around me looked down uncomfortably. I finally broke the silence and told him, "We really appreciate the food, but this venue isn't what we are looking for." It was the first time he had addressed me directly, and he looked completely taken aback. He turned to one of my male friends as if to double check my statement, and my friend responded, "Well, it's her event." The owner's face fell. In truth, there were valid reasons for declining. The venue's minimum capacity didn't work for us, and I wasn't comfortable with their plans to rent out the upstairs for a separate event. But his lack of social awareness made the decision even easier. He lost a £9,000 booking that day, and I hope it served as a lesson. Watching his expression when he realized I was the decision maker was the most satisfying part of the entire experience. The next story is called Called the Cops. Back when I was in high school, I lived in an apartment complex with my father and stepmother. One night I had a friend staying over. My father and stepmother were out for the evening, so it was just my friend and me at home. Around 11 or 11:30 p.m. there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, 2 police officers were standing there. They entered the apartment and started asking us questions like, "Whose alcohol is that? It belonged to my parents." And "Why do you have books on witchcraft?" I explained that I enjoyed studying different religions. Before leaving, the officer said that our neighbor had complained about noise and told us to keep it down. The thing is, we weren't making any noise, but we didn't argue. About 30 minutes later, my stepmother came home and I told her what had happened. She assured me she'd handle it and told my friend and me to go to bed. The next morning I asked her about what had happened. She explained that after I told her about the situation, she called the police herself to file a noise complaint against the neighbor who had originally complained about us. The police showed up at the neighbor's apartment and knocked on their door. The neighbor refused to open it, saying they wouldn't talk to the officer without a warrant. The police left, but returned shortly after with a warrant. When they entered the neighbor's apartment, they found a lot of illegal stuff. The neighbor ended up getting arrested. The last story is called Senior Year Revenge. During my senior year of high school, I was in the journalism class, where I wrote and illustrated monthly for the school newspaper. I was a quirky and creative person back then, much like I am now, which made me an easy target for some of the less kind students. There was one boy in particular who seemed to go out of his way to make my life difficult. He would call me names, make fun of my appearance, spit in my hair, trip me as I walked by, and even openly mock my work, encouraging others to laugh along with him. It was relentless, and no matter what I did, he wouldn't stop. As the semester came to a close, we had a huge final project. It required compiling a complete folder of all the work we'd done throughout the year. Missing work meant losing points, and failing to submit the folder would result in failing the course entirely. One day, after a particularly rough class, where he'd been picking on me again, I was the last person left in the classroom, tidying up before heading out. That's when I noticed his folder sitting in the class workstation. For a moment I thought about all the ways he'd made me feel small, and decided to take a stand in my own way. Without overthinking it, I slipped his folder into my bag, left the classroom, and later threw it into the dumpster behind a nearby coffee shop. Because he didn't have his completed folder, combined with his habit of slacking off, he ended up failing the course and had to attend summer school to make up for the credit. Thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please don't forget to leave a like, comment and subscribe. And if you have time, watch another one of my videos. Also, if you want to support me further, check out the channel membership or Patreon. And now, I hope you have a great day. See you soon. Bye bye.